Go.
I'll just read the first line. What effect did the colonial experiences have on the founders' view about rights and government? Go.
Despite 100 years of physical separation, colonial communities maintained certain similarities to British society. The colonies were initially founded on royal charters which, influenced by English common law, guaranteed the colonists individual liberties, rights of Englishmen.
These charters established the idea common to both colonies and English society that men are born with basic individual rights which government cannot take away. These English legal traditions so heavily influenced the founders that the Eighth Amendment reflects the language of the 1689 English Bill of Rights nearly verbatim.
While there are many cultural similarities between the colonies and Great Britain, circumstances generated crucial differences. In terms of property, the island of Great Britain had limited land, mostly owned by the aristocracy, while the New World had cheap, nearly boundless land that was easy to attain, allowing for far more diverse property owners.
In England, rank among classes was stratified by family name or title. However, a noble title meant nothing in the colonies, where one survived on hard work alone. This social fluidity created an equal opportunity to advance in society.
The Mayflower Compact, the first governing document of the New England colonies, greatly resembled the Magna Carta and represented how the colonists' views of rights aligned with those of the British. This experience influenced Article 25 of the Delaware State Constitution, which demonstrates the influence of British law on state constitutions. The common law of England shall remain in force.
Salutary neglect, the time period from the founding of Jamestown until the proclamation of 1763, allowed colonial governments time to evolve individual identities without the Crown's heavy hand. The protest of the Quartering Act of 1765 strengthened the founders' belief in the Old English proverb, a man's home is his castle, a view now expressed in the Third Amendment of the Constitution.
Writs of assistance were general warrants issued by the Crown that allowed arbitrary search and seizure of nearly anything. They evoked such negative response that multiple early state constitutions provided against them, including the North Carolina Constitution, which stated in Article 11 that general warrants are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be granted.
Natural rights philosophy emphasizes the right of an individual and the idea of a social contract made among persons in a state of nature as consent to form a government. John Locke's Second Treatise of Government established the doctrine of natural, inalienable rights by stating, all men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions as they think fit within the bounds of the law of nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau dictated the theory of social contract, which delineated a government in which no one else may subject him without his consent, and influenced the creation of the Mayflower Compact.
These philosophies are reflected in early state constitutions, such as the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which states that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive.
Classical republicanism established civic virtue, impressed the responsibilities upon citizens to actively participate in government, and emphasized moral education. This is exemplified in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which stated, wisdom and knowledge, as well as virtue, diffused generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties.
Classical Republicans would argue that citizen responsibilities, such as voting and political participation, entail the highest form of duty and dedication to the common good, and are the first priorities of any citizen.
As Abraham Lincoln eulogized, our nation is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Of the people represents the social contract theory of natural rights. By the people stems from the colonial experiences of a monarchical government. For the people embodies the idea of civic virtue and classical republicanism. This key American phrase unifies natural rights, classical republicanism, and 18th century colonial experiences. Thank you.
355. I got some questions for you.
Kaepernick.
What was the relationship between the colonists and the British government specifically during the time period of salutary neglect? I mean, how was government set up in the colonies, and how did it function between the colonists and the British government?
The colonies were initially set up on royal charters, where most of the time there was a royal governor who was outlined, or the system of government in the colonies was outlined by that charter, which also was what allowed them to settle the land in the first place. And when salutary neglect settled in, these royal charters they still had set up the government, but they didn't really mean much because Britain wasn't exactly enforcing anything.
And these charters allowed for the colonies to make their individual assemblies, which led later to very distinct regional separation, because they were used to having these kind of autonomous assemblies in which the British government had some influence over, but during the times of salutary neglect really didn't invoke that influence.
What else specifically do they have in the colonial governments other than assemblies, like you said?
They had legislatures that were generally 2 houses, which definitely influenced how our government is today.
This was a bicameral legislature, and the executive was especially given hardly any power. In most cases, he could only have veto power because the colonists feared, they were using their experiences that they feared from a monarchical government. And
Also,
constitutions.
typical in these governments, there was, it was elected by the citizens, at least landholding citizens, which was similar to Great Britain, although there were more opportunities for land in the United States, or in the colonies at that point, which meant that there was a larger population who would be voting, and so that was also a typical trait of the colonies.
Was Parliament uniformly in favor of taxing colonists to have to fetch any more? Or was there some real opposition in Parliament?
I'm not positive, but I believe that if there was any opposition, it wasn't it wasn't a majority or not even a majority, it wasn't even significant by any means. The idea that, in Great Britain at least, there was the idea that the colonies were sort of in debt to the Great Britain for the service that the British military had done during the 7 Years' War.
Do we still have an aristocracy today?
The idea of an aristocracy, at least the one that was typified in earlier America and Great Britain, was a landowning aristocracy, and the ability for the American people to own land really shifted the idea of an aristocracy. Indeed, there are people who are wealthy in the United States who own a lot of property or a large stake in the economy. We heard a lot during the Occupy Wall Street protests of the 1% versus the 99%, 1% of the people owning 99% of the wealth. While they would be defined as an aristocracy in modern terms, certainly they don't own the majority of the land as they would in like early America.
There are men like Bill Gates who do own a lot of money, but as the Declaration of Independence states, even though it's not lawful, the idea in the Declaration of Independence that allows people to pursue their life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness does say that in America we can pursue to be part of the aristocracy if we do not have it now.
Although the aristocracy, the modern aristocracy, does not own land, they recently decided that that money was free speech, in which case, if you were to consider the aristocracy those who are very wealthy, they indeed own a stake in the government. They own more speech, essentially, than many of the people who are not part of the aristocracy.
Where did the founders get it wrong in the Constitution? Despite what Anthony Scalia says the Constitution isn't perfect, where did they get it wrong?
The idea, unfortunately, it's not an area where they got it wrong in the Constitution. It's an area where a problem has developed somewhere where they didn't intend it to. AKA, the idea of freedom of speech is a great idea, and certainly it is one of the most fundamental values in the United States. But now we've seen the emergence of hyperpartisanship and problems accompanied with allowing every subgroup to exert their authority on the national government, which makes doing things like as trivial as passing a law that doesn't really affect much. There's always some sort of constituency that's going to argue against it, whether it's a lobby or a non-profit organization or whatever. Either way, that sort of subgroup or the idea of partisanship has indeed become a problem within something that shouldn't be a problem in the Constitution.
When the Constitution was originally drafted, the Electoral College was a very great idea. It was an influence of Aristotle's idea of mob rule, that if you give direct democracy to everybody, then 51% can overrule the 49, and that's not necessarily fair. But in the modern era, the Electoral College doesn't necessarily seem to work it definitely doesn't work the way it was intended to, and now before the election is even technically finished, we have already decided who's won, and there were only a couple swing states, and those were the only ones who really mattered, which is a problem.
I think they went wrong in not more explicitly delineating certain rights that citizens should have. Such, for example, the preamble to the Constitution mentions welfare of the citizens, yet there is nowhere in the Constitution other than the 10th Amendment that says how the welfare can be guaranteed to citizens. So that's one place in which it was lacking. Yet this being said, it allows for more flexibility today.
They may have hoped too much that people would lend a hand to those below them, because in John Rawls' theory of justice, he says in his difference principle that those who are more advantaged than disadvantaged people should do that which is in their power to help those under them. And today in society, we can't always see that with people who have lots of money.
We'll have to stop. Colonel Merritt.
Okay, Mr. Crowder.
Oh, it's the year, by the way.
He's